Hello, everyone. World War II is a subject that fascinates many. It was an armed conflict that lasted from 1939 to 1945. Most European countries, Japan, China, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, and the Soviet Union were involved. It had different combat fronts, and its consequences reformed the global order. It is to be expected that, on this subject, there will be many things to talk about. A point of interest for some people is to see the position of the different countries during the war. Did they participate directly or not? Which side did they support? It is known that Brazil and Mexico had a demonstrated support for the Allied forces against the Axis, even sending troops. Other countries, on the other hand, decided to remain neutral, such as Argentina. This, in the historiography of the Allied countries, is not seen in a good light, since it is perceived as passive support towards the Axis, that is, Germany, Japan, and Italy. Argentina, in particular, is highly questioned for this, including the fact that there were former leaders of the German National Socialist Party who escaped to that country. However, it is not mentioned that there were other former members of the party who traveled and worked in the United States or Great Britain. Now, what about other countries? Returning to South America, what about Paraguay? Paraguay is a country located in the center of South America. Like other countries, it became independent from Spain at the beginning of the 19th century. When talking about the situation in Paraguay during World War II, data, context, and other things are usually omitted in the accounts of historians or people who upload videos to YouTube, maintaining a very superficial knowledge. It is not surprising, since Paraguay is a small and isolated country. Perhaps the information that is obtained is not the best. In this video, we will talk about what really happened in Paraguay during World War II. The Chaco War. The first fact that everyone ignores is that, towards the end of 1930, Paraguay had just emerged from an international war. The Chaco War lasted from 1932 to 1935. Bolivia and Paraguay disputed the territory of the northern Chaco. In 1935, an armistice was signed. The Paraguayan state had undertaken the war with a very limited economy. That is, the state's treasurer had enough to sustain the war for a few years, but not to continue it longer than necessary, which was what Bolivia intended, in what would have been a true war of attrition. Therefore, it was in Paraguay's interest to end the war once and for all, with the advantage it had in 1935. However, the following year, in 1936, a military uprising took place, led by Colonels Federico Smith and Camilo Recalde. This coup overthrew President Eusebio Ayala. Some point to the reasons for this uprising as a general discontent against the Liberal Party, which had been governing uninterruptedly since 1904. This discontent had already been brewing before the war, but the conflict with Bolivia put the social movements of 1920 on hold. This came from both the former combatants returning from the war, as well as the military leadership and other members of the opposition. The result of this coup was that Colonel Rafael Franco assumed the provisional presidency on February 20th. Franco's government is very interesting, as it brought together different sectors of society that, seen closely, did not have much in common beyond their anti-liberalism and ultranationalist sentiments. There were conservatives, socialists, fascists, and revolutionary nationalists, the latter close to what could be called the third position. The Colorado Party, who were the main opponents of the Liberal Party, supported the February coup. However, after Colonel Franco decided to form his own governing party, they decided to abandon him. Another issue was that the government decreed several anti-communist laws, which earned him the distance of this group. In the end, Franco decided to approach the revolutionary nationalists. However, the liberals allied themselves with a group of dissatisfied military men and overthrew Franco in 1937. After 1936, as we have seen, Paraguay experienced an abrupt change of government in just 2 years. In 1937, in an understanding with the military, the liberals returned to power. Franco's government had repealed the 1870 Constitution, under which the country had been governed all this time. After the lawyer Felix Paiva assumed as president, the 1870 Constitution was reinstated. Despite this, the military influence on the government did not end. There were attempts at coups d'état that were stopped. Now, we must remember another important point. In 1935, an armistice was signed with Bolivia, but not a definitive peace treaty. The peace negotiations with Bolivia lasted from 1936 to 1938, almost as long as the war lasted. This is due to the institutional instability of Paraguay and Bolivia after the conflict. Despite the war, neither country was thinking of turning back. Changes in government involved changes in foreign ministers and rethinking at the negotiating table. Finally, the definitive treaty was signed on July 21, 1938. A year later, the Second World War would formally begin. Paraguay was still not close to normalizing its institutional situation. The 1940s. In 1939, the Army proposed to present the candidacy of General José Félix Estigarribia. Estigarribia assumed as commander-in-chief of the armed forces in 1933 during the war. In the coup of February 1936, he was exiled along with President Ayala. He returned to Paraguay in 1937 after the fall of Franco. While they were preparing his candidacy, he served as a diplomat in the United States. The Liberals agreed with the military to support Estigarribia's presidency, with the promise of returning order to the country. Estigarribia assumed office on August 15, 1939. Colonel Franco dissolved parliament, so congressional elections had to be prepared. However, there was much opposition from parties against Estigarribia, as well as student demonstrations. Estigarribia, who had the support of the Liberal Party, decided to change his cabinet and govern only with the armed forces, which caused the traditional liberal leaders to distance themselves. But there was a liberal youth who, contrary to the guidelines of their party, supported the establishment of a military government to restore order. For this reason, they supported the drafting of a new constitution in 1940, which had more authoritarian overtones. However, in September 1940, General Estigarribia, along with his wife and the pilot Carmelo Peralta, died in a plane crash. This left the state completely stunned, which, through the new constitution, had to choose a successor through a meeting between the Council of State and the House of Representatives, state entities that had not yet been formed. This caused the top generals of the armed forces to decide to choose a successor to Estigarribia with the sole purpose of calling elections. Many maintain that the final decision was made in a simple draw involving a matchbox. Depending on which side the matchbox landed on, one of the candidates was chosen. In the end, they chose General Higinio Morinigo. He took office in September 1940. Morinigo was a military man with known anti-liberal and anti-political parties tendencies, so at first he approached the members of the third position, a group called Tiempistas, or Timpists, who published their ideas through the newspaper El Tiempo, the Time, called themselves revolutionary nationalists. They held ideas very close to Italian fascism, Spanish phalangism, and even the Salazar government in Portugal, as they considered themselves Catholic nationalists. Morinigo did the opposite of what his comrades expected and postponed the elections until 1943. By that date, Morinigo had persecuted the majority of liberal, socialist, and Colorado supporters. Morinigo presented himself and won the elections as the sole candidate. The government of General Morinigo. At first, as we have said, Morinigo distrusted the traditional parties. He even banned the Liberal Party. Therefore, he wanted to get closer to the third position movements. Among them were also the followers of Colonel Franco, since Morinigo defined his government as the continuation of the February 1936 revolution. Despite the attempt, an alliance between Morinigo and Franco did not materialize for reasons still unknown. In the end, Morinigo had to form temporary political alliances according to the situation. This allowed him to govern for quite a long time. This pendular attitude was reflected in other aspects of his government. On the one hand, Morinigo's main military chiefs were openly pro-Axis. However, Morinigo decided to ally himself more with the United States, although not so openly, for fear that his generals would overthrow him. Thus, Paraguay broke relations with the Axis powers in 1942, which brought many economic benefits from the United States, which allowed the development of several infrastructure projects. During this first period, between 1940 and 1945, Morinigo sought a way to cut off the power of the pro-Axis generals who met in a group that was known as the War Front. In fact, it is theorized that it was because of the influence of this group that Morinigo had to remove the Timapiestas and Francoists from his cabinet. Also, various military insurrections occurred between 1941 and 1946, but they were crushed and controlled. Finally, with Germany's defeat looming, Mornigo felt secure to decide to declare war on the Axis powers. It would not be until 1946, through a clever plan involving Juan Domingo Perón's assumption of power in Argentina, that Mornigo was able to dismiss and neutralize the generals of the war front. This led to what is known as the Paraguayan Democratic Spring, where, under pressure from Brazil and the United States, political parties were again allowed to carry out activities. It was proposed to draft a new constitution and call for elections. This period would end with the bloody Paraguayan Civil War of 1947. That was the true situation of Paraguay during the World War II. We see that Paraguay lived a period of instability after the Chaco War, in addition to its worrying economic situation. The situation became relatively normalized by 1943. We cannot deny that there were people who felt inspired by the European authoritarian governments of that time. Just as in the 19th century, the American people were inspired by the liberal revolutions because it was the great novelty. However, the personal position of some government officials is not the same as the official position of the government. Thank you for watching this video.